The first arrow thudded into the barn door just as the sun crested the ridge. Ezekiel Cole froze, his hands still gripping the milk pail, the morning chill suddenly sharp as a blade against his skin. Through the cracks in the weathered wood, he could see them. Shadows moving in the mist, silent as ghosts. Apaches. And they hadn't come for trade. He should have known. The girl had been too quiet when he found her at dusk, curled up in his hayloft like a wounded animal. Her dress was torn, her feet wrapped in bloodied rags, her eyes holding a fire that no amount of shivering could extinguish. She hadn't spoken a word when he tossed her the blanket, hadn't flinched when he set the tin plate of beans and cornbread beside her. Now, as the second arrow buried itself in the doorframe an inch from his head, Ezekiel realized his mistake. No Apache woman wanders alone, and no warrior lets his kin go unclaimed. A voice cut through the fog, speaking in the slow, deliberate tones of a man who knew his enemy was listening. "You have something that belongs to us, white man." Ezekiel set the pail down carefully. His rifle leaned against the far wall, 10 paces away. Useless. He took a breath. Then he pushed the barn door open with his boot, hands raised. 20 mounted warriors stared back at him. Their faces were painted for war. At their lead sat an older man, his braids streaked with silver, his eyes black and depthless. The girl from the loft, now clean, wrapped in a borrowed coat, stood beside his horse, her fingers curled around the warrior's stirrup. She hadn't been shivering after all, Ezekiel realized. She'd been waiting. The warrior dismounted, his moccasins silent in the dirt. When he spoke again, his breath fogged in the dawn air. "My daughter says you fed her." Ezekiel's throat went dry. Somewhere in the trees, a raven called. The girl's gaze never left his face. And Ezekiel Cole, who had survived Comanche raids and Colorado winters, understood, for the first time in his life, what it meant to be truly judged. But let's go back to where it all started. The girl had appeared at dusk like a shadow taking shape. Ezekiel had been mending the corral fence when he felt the weight of eyes on his back. He turned, expecting a coyote or maybe a stray calf. Instead, he saw her. Maybe 16, maybe younger, standing at the tree line where the pines swallowed the last of the sun. Her feet were bare. Blood streaked the torn hem of her dress. Ezekiel's hand drifted toward his revolver. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, breathing hard, her dark eyes locked on his. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something metallic. Blood. Fresh. Ezekiel glanced past her into the trees. No movement, no sounds but the evening wind. He thought about the stories told in town about Apache raiding parties, about stolen cattle and burned homesteads. Thought about the way Sheriff Hale had grinned last week when he'd pinned up the notice. $100 bounty for every warrior's scalp brought to the fort. The girl swayed on her feet. Ezekiel exhaled through his nose. Then he did the stupidest thing he'd done in 42 years of living. He held out his canteen. She didn't take it at first, just stared at the offering like it might bite her. When she finally stepped forward, her movements were stiff, deliberate. Up close, he could see the bruises circling her wrists, the raw skin around her ankles where ropes had been. Run away, he realized. But from who? She snatched the canteen and drank like she was trying to drown herself in it. Water spilled down her chin, mixing with the dirt on her neck. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and said one word in heavily accented English. "Bon." Not a question, a demand. Ezekiel studied her face, the high cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw. She wasn't begging. She was negotiating. He jerked his chin toward the weathered structure. "Hayloft's dry." She was already moving before he finished speaking, her bare feet silent in the dust. Ezekiel watched her disappear into the shadows between the barn doors. Then he looked down at his canteen, still damp from her lips. In town, they'd call this treason. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called. Ezekiel stared into the gathering dark for a long moment before following her inside. He left the barn door unlocked. That was his second mistake. The pre-dawn cold bit through Ezekiel's coat as he stepped onto the porch, coffee steaming in his tin cup. 3 hours of fitful sleep had left him groggy, but the girl's presence in his barn had kept him alert to every creak of the house. Then he saw the hoofprints. Dozens of them pressed into the frost along the tree line. Fresh. His cup hit the porch boards with a clatter. The barn door stood slightly ajar. He'd closed it last night. As he watched, a shadow moved behind the crack. Not the girl.
Something taller.
Ezekiel's pulse hammered in his throat. His rifle leaned against the doorframe inside the house. Too far. A low whistle cut through the stillness. The call of a red-tailed hawk, out of season. Apache signal. Movement flickered at the edge of the pasture. Then another. Shapes resolved from the mist. Mounted warriors. Their faces streaked with ochre and charcoal. They emerged silently, forming a loose semicircle around the homestead. No war cries, no gunfire, just the creak of saddle leather and the occasional snort of a horse. The barn door swung open. The girl stepped out, wrapped in Ezekiel's spare coat, her hair now braided neatly. Behind her loomed the silver-haired warrior from before. Her father, judging by the way his hand rested on her shoulder. His eyes locked onto Ezekiel. "You kept your word," the warrior said in clear English. "The barn. The food." Ezekiel forced his hands to stay at his sides, away from the revolver he wasn't wearing. "She asked." The warrior's mouth tightened. He said something low in Apache to the girl, who responded with a sharp shake of her head. When the warrior looked back at Ezekiel, his gaze had changed. "My daughter says you didn't touch her. Didn't even look at her the way white men do." A beat. "Is this true?" Ezekiel thought of the girl's bruised wrists last night. The way she'd flinched when he'd moved too suddenly. "I gave her shelter. Nothing more." The warriors murmured among themselves. The girl said something urgent in Apache, gripping her father's arm. A horse snorted. The silver-haired warrior studied Ezekiel for a long moment, then made a subtle hand gesture. Like magic, bows lowered. Spears tilted toward the ground. "You will come," the warrior said. "Both of you." Ezekiel's stomach dropped. "Where?" The girl answered, her English deliberate. "To see what they did to us." She held out her arm, pushing back the coat sleeve to reveal fresh scars circling her wrist like a bracelet. Iron burns. Suddenly Ezekiel understood the blood on her dress last night. The rope's marks. The way she'd moved like a whipped dog expecting another blow. Somewhere beyond the trees, a church bell began to toll in the distant town. The sound carried clearly through the morning air. The same town where Sheriff Hale displayed his collection of Apache scalps above the saloon bar. Ezekiel met the warrior's eyes and nodded. "I'll get my horse." The abandoned mission house stood in a hollow between two hills, its adobe walls crumbling, its wooden cross blackened by fire. Ezekiel dismounted behind the war party, his skin prickling at the scent of old smoke still clinging to the place. The girl, Nalin, her father had called her, walked ahead without hesitation. She moved differently now, shoulders straight, the morning sun catching the silver beads woven into her braids. The transformation from the shivering fugitive in his barn made Ezekiel's chest tighten. Then they rounded the corner of the mission. Bodies, 8 of them, arranged carefully on woven mats in the shade of a surviving cottonwood. Women and elders, their hands folded over chests stitched with bullet wounds. A child no older than 6 lay curled beside a gray-haired woman, as if sleeping. Nalin knelt beside the smallest body, her fingers brushing the child's cheek. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. The black robes said, "We must learn of their God." Then the soldiers came at night. Ezekiel's stomach turned. He recognized the pattern: raids disguised as conversions, a favorite tactic of the so-called Indian reformers. He'd heard the boasts in town. Better dead than heathen. The silver-haired warrior, Kuli, Nalin's father, stepped forward. They took the young ones first. To civilize. His gaze burned into Ezekiel. "My daughter escaped the school. They followed." Nalin rolled up her sleeve, showing the brand again. "For running." Ezekiel's hands curled into fists. He'd known about the schools, of course. Every settler did. But seeing the evidence carved into living flesh, Kuli made a sharp gesture. Two warriors dragged a bound figure from the ruined mission. A man in a torn priest's cassock, his face swollen with bruises. This one lived, Kuli said. The priest whimpered, his eyes wild when they landed on Ezekiel. Mercy! I only followed orders. Nalin spat at his feet. Kuli drew a knife, offering the hilt to Ezekiel. Justice is yours. You sheltered my blood. The warriors fell silent. Even the wind seemed to still. Ezekiel stared at the knife. He'd killed before in self-defense in war. But this, the priest sobbed. They'll hang you for this. The army will. Nalin moved suddenly, snatching the knife from her father's hand. She pressed it into Ezekiel's palm, her fingers steady despite the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Not for him, she whispered. For the children. The priest screamed when Ezekiel turned. The blade flashed once in the sunlight. When it was done, Ezekiel wiped the knife clean on the dead man's robes and handed it back to Kuli. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. They'll come for revenge. Kuli sheathed the knife. Let them. He nodded to his warriors, who began preparing the bodies for proper burial. Then, to Ezekiel, you ride with us now. It wasn't a question. Nalin watched him, waiting. In her eyes, Ezekiel saw the same unspoken challenge as that first night at the barn. Not pleading, but offering. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Somewhere far off, a train whistle blew. Ezekiel took a deep breath and reached for his horse's reins. Which way? They burned the mission at dawn. Ezekiel watched from horseback as flames licked up the broken walls, consuming the place where Nalin had been held, where the others had died. The Apache sang as it burned, low, mournful words that rose with the smoke into the pale morning sky. Kuli rode up beside him, his face unreadable in the flickering light. Your people will call this a massacre. Ezekiel didn't answer. His gaze drifted to Nalin, who stood closest to the fire, her silhouette wavering in the heat. She hadn't spoken since the burial rites, since she'd placed the last stone on the small grave at the edge of the clearing. Will you go back? Kuli asked. The question hung between them. Ezekiel thought of his homestead, the unmended fence, the coffee cup still lying on the porch where he'd dropped it. Thought of Sheriff Hale's face when the first reports came in. Traitor. Squawman. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Nalin turned then, her eyes finding Ezekiel's across the distance. She didn't smile, but something in her expression eased. The look of someone who has finally been heard. Ezekiel adjusted his grip on the reins. No, he said. I won't. Kuli nodded once, then urged his horse forward toward the rising sun. The war party fell in behind him, hooves kicking up dust that glowed like embers in the early light. Nalin waited until Ezekiel drew even with her before nudging her own horse into motion. They rode side by side for a while in silence, the fire at their backs, the wind in their faces. After a time, she reached into her pouch and handed him something. A small carved figure of a running horse, its mane flowing like water. For the barn, she said. Ezekiel turned it over in his hands, feeling the careful grooves where the artist's knife had been. A gift, a reminder. Somewhere ahead, Kuli began to sing again, his voice carrying clear and strong over the open land. Nalin kicked her horse into a trot, then a gallop, her braids streaming behind her like banners. Ezekiel followed, the carved horse clutched tight in his fist, the wind sharp and clean in his lungs. Behind them, the smoke curled upward, fading into the endless blue sky. Ahead, the land stretched on wild and free and waiting.